AEDT 1170U, Psychological Foundations and Digital Technologies, Module 6, Video 6.2. Today we'll look at the lenses of transformational learning, or how are you actually approaching your learning. Here are the guiding questions for the video. Describe Taylor's lenses for transformational learning perspectives. Using some examples from your own experience as a student or as an employee, how do you think these lenses apply to your own learning or training? Taylor developed 7 lenses through which to view transformational learning, and they come in 2 groups. The first group is where the locus of learning is in the individual, and the second group is where the locus of learning is socio-cultural or within the environment. I hope you're starting to see some themes here as we go from way back at the beginning of this course with the nature-nurture models of society and psychology, and we're still in the middle of that continuum between the individual and the environment, and where does our learning come from. So let's take a look at Taylor's lenses. Group 1 are models that focus on the individual, and first of all there's Mezirow, who talk about the psychocritical theory of adult learning, Delos, who used a psychodevelopmental approach and talked about the intuitive nature of transformational learning, and Boyd, who used more of a psychoanalytic approach and the importance of symbols and the unconscious in transformational learning. And remember, that word psychoanalysis goes way back to Freud's emphasis on the importance of the unconscious. The second group will be social cultural. Freire talked about the social action and the emancipatory view of transformational learning. He focused on emerging from a context of poverty and oppression, and that we need to transform our learning to focus on making some radical social change. Tisdale talked about more of a cultural, spiritual view of transformative learning, and that socially constructed personalities of individuals and their knowledge construction through storytelling is an important part of the learning. This approach fosters more of a cultural and spiritual kind of awareness. Going on with Group 2, we have Sherrod, who had a race-centric view based on African descent, and this one sees transformative learning as a daily conscious strategy, something we have to keep coming back to on a daily basis. And O'Sullivan looked at transformational learning in a planetary view, focusing on the interconnectedness between the universe, the plants, our natural environment, everything around us. So let's take a little bit more detailed look at each one of these. Mezirow's psychocritical approach. His first work was based on interviews of women who returned to college and work, and how adults made sense out of their life experience based on their life context. He was the one who talked about frames of reference, habits of mind, and points of view being made up of schemas, and each of these schemes is involved in your life as well. You each have a frame of reference, your family, your cultural background, and the things you learned growing up about learning that make the schemes in your life. Transformational learning occurs, you would say, when we shift one of our beliefs, and that changes our entire perspective. It could make our perspective more inclusive, more open, more emotionally capable of change, and more reflective. But remember, not all learning is transformative. Just as we said in the adult stages of life module, whether you learn from the experience is entirely up to the individual. In order to have that learning experience, you need to include some critical reflection, some critical discourse, which is what we do in tutorial, and some action, which is what you'll do in your problem-based learning group assignments. So the learner has that responsibility to critically examine his or her own assumptions about how the experience has been interpreted. It is seen as a rational endeavor, a thinking endeavor, and a conscious endeavor by Mezirow, and that's why it is called the psychocritical approach. The next one is Delos, the psychodevelopmental approach, and this is a little bit more holistic and intuitive. As you can see, the quote from Delos, that the first business of the guide or the facilitator or instruction is to listen to the dreams of the pilgrim. That's a lot more spiritual basis than what Mezirow was talking about. Delos also focused on adults returning to higher education and felt that education is a transformational journey, and that the mentor is there to serve as a challenger, a coach, a guide, a supporter. Boyd also used a psychodevelopmental approach and predates the attention on spirituality and adult education that we see today. This approach is grounded in depth psychology, and that it sees a really deep inner journey of individualization, and that's what transformation is about, going very deeply individually. It also defines transformation as a fundamental change in personality. So let's think about that for a sec, because when we studied personality, we said that those theorists, trait theorists, said that our traits generally don't change. So transformation and transpersonal psychology is a much newer way to look at things that would say that we don't keep all our traits, that we are moldable, we are changeable if we're open to the experience and we can learn. And Boyd also says that dialogue is an important process. So we're trying to follow that model in this course by giving you some opportunities in tutorial to dialogue with the TA and dialogue with each other. Freire's was a social emancipatory approach where you want to take social action, and his work as a Brazilian educator emerged from sort of working with farmers in the mid-20th century. The context was that poverty and illiteracy and oppression was sort of part of a larger framework of overall social oppression. So he had a couple of terms: banking education, which was totally teacher-centered, that the all-knowing teacher emits this knowledge to the students who are oppressed and don't really participate. And then problem-posing education, which was a much better way, that was liberating. There's a different kind of relationship between teacher and student, and they become co-investigators, and talking and dialogue is extremely important in this model. Tisdale focused on a cultural spiritual approach, where spirituality is fundamentally how we make sense of our lives, that our dreams and the symbols are important. I think how this challenges the predominant Western way of thinking, which is that logical, left brain, rational thought is sort of the higher order of thinking. While this way of thinking says that no, the whole person learning is emphasized, and that learners in each different context, whether it's different cultural, racial, gender, or sexual orientation, do construct their own knowledge. So each of you comes from a varied context that is going to really shape and color the kind of knowledge that you create in this course. This approach should be fostered by having cross-cultural relationships, and the facilitators or the educators would be grounded and community-based in culturally relevant settings. Sherrod's approach was race-centric, which focused on African descent people who are at the center of this model. It's very culturally bound and non-individualistic, and it's grounded in sort of the oppositional spirit, as minority cultures are living in opposition to the cultural norm. That's Merriam who says that. This model would say that our sociocultural, political, and historical context matters. And one of the examples of this would be the Afrocentric school in the Toronto District School Board, that is fairly recent and is based on a race-centric approach to education. And there is debate on both sides as to whether this is a good idea or that is an idea that causes segregation. We may talk about that in tutorial. But it's an approach that's fostered by including traditional voices, a sense of belonging to the group, and an importance that there's more than one kind of knowledge that needs to be valued, and that our own biographical cultural knowledge is an important way that we shape our learning. And finally, O'Sullivan's planetary approach. We're approaching more spiritual connections this way, and interconnectedness between the universe and the community and the natural world. That the goal of this approach in transformative learning is a planetary consciousness. I want you to think whether you believe technology is helping us to do this more or not. When we're more aware of what's happening in the world, are we able to take more action on it, or do we just leave it as information and not do anything about it? This approach emphasizes quality of life issues, fostering community connectedness and responsibility in the larger picture, and it's very unique in how it focuses our attention on connection to the natural world. An example of that might be how different cultures approach education and science education. If you're predominantly downtown city science educator, you may be focused on the nature of science as you learned it. But if you are somewhere up in an Inuit school, the nature of science tends to be more connected to the spiritual world. So they have a very different view of the earth and how our responsibility is to the earth. You might think of some good examples that you can share in tutorial on that. Synthesis questions for this video. Take some time to review each of Taylor's 7 lenses, and in tutorial this week, discuss how you see these present in your current school or work context. You might see some of them or none of them. See which ones that you observe. Each individual in our group will choose the lens that they most relate to and will describe why. So that might depend on your own background or something that's happened in your life, but there will probably be one of these lenses that you're most comfortable with. And you're going to choose that lens that you find most difficult to relate to and describe why. So hopefully when we get to tutorial, we'll have a very rich discussion that will demonstrate to you that we each use transformative lenses differently.